He wasn't captured for rebelling, nor condemned for a crime. He was marked simply for being young, beautiful, and vulnerable. In the Roman Empire, that was enough. Felix didn't have a childhood. He had training. He didn't know freedom. He was adorned. To the lords of the Republic, his body was a display. To the elite, his silence was convenient. No one asked his name, because to name someone is to acknowledge their humanity. And in Rome, that was far too dangerous. And if you, like so many of us, seek true stories that expose what the books chose to ignore, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters. And tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I always read them. At 12 years old, Felix still believed life revolved around the smell of freshly baked bread in the morning and the warmth of his mother's hands. But that afternoon, a Roman horse stopped in his village. He didn't understand the stares, nor the fingers that touched his face like one examines a rare object. Within hours, he was being taken, not to learn a trade, but to vanish as a person. The senator who bought him wasn't looking for a servant. He was after something to showcase. Felix was acquired like one would acquire a jewel for its appearance. His fair skin, restless eyes, and youthful fragility made him perfect for a role no school ever taught, that of pleasing through practiced smiles the unspoken appetites of the elite. The contract didn't speak of labor. It spoke of obedience. No name, no will, no future of his own. In the carriage, as the sun sank behind the hills, the boy tried to remember his mother's face. But even that seemed to fade, as if his identity was being erased with every mile. Rome didn't need another slave. It needed a spectacle, and he had been chosen for the lead role. Felix's arrival at the palace wasn't marked by chains, but by silk. There were no whips or screams, just murmured commands and stiff smiles. He was guided through marble corridors to a secluded wing where silence was the law. This area wasn't for ordinary servants, but for a special kind of possession, the untouchables. The room where Felix was placed had everything to enchant the eye. Oriental tapestries, rare perfumes, soft cushions, a stone-carved bathtub from Carthage. But no windows, no door that opened without permission. It was luxury that suffocated, a polished cage. The attendants avoided eye contact. They bowed. They called him Little Master. It wasn't a nickname. It was a label. He belonged to someone, and that someone demanded perfection. In the first few days, Felix tried asking where he was, when he could return home, if he could write to his mother. The questions got no answers. Only instructions followed. How to walk, how to smile, how to fold his hands before guests. He soon realized that speaking without being addressed was seen as insubordination, and any trace of personality was treated as a flaw. What looked like privilege was, in truth, conditioning. Every piece of clothing was selected not for comfort, but for aesthetics. Every piece of fruit served was part of a regimen designed to keep him delicate, slim, young. His body had become a project, shaped by invisible hands to fit the particular tastes of a master he hadn't even met. Over time, Felix began to understand the silent dynamics of that place. The older attendants never dared cross the threshold of his room. They called it sacred, but their tone was one of fear, not reverence. He discovered that the same room had been occupied before, and before that, by another. No one lasted. When they lost the freshness of youth, they vanished without notice, and a new one was chosen. Always beautiful, always silent. Such was the routine of a male concubine in the Rome of the powerful, a living showcase, decorated like a relic, confined like a threat. Felix had everything, except freedom. Each day he learned that the linen sheets concealed more than comfort. They masked the brutal logic of a society where the body was a display and silence was mandatory. Rome didn't need to chain those already trained, not to flee. Luxury was the perfect cage, and Felix, even without fully grasping the rules of the game, already felt imprisoned, not by walls, but by a system where beauty was a sentence. As the days went by, Felix realized that the Golden Room wasn't a reward. It was the stage for a meticulous and perverse process. The real training began there, between silent walls and a fragrance too sweet to be natural. The one responsible for his formation was an elderly eunuch named Egrillo, with a rigid face and a voice that never rose. There were no shouts or physical punishments, but discipline was absolute. Egrillo didn't smile, he didn't comfort, he only instructed. He began early, before the sun rose over the rooftops of Rome, with a list of tasks that felt more like choreography than chores. How to sit without making noise, how to smile without showing teeth, how to lower your eyes when praised, but not so much that you looked careless. Felix was forced to repeat gestures, lines, expressions. If he got it wrong, he'd start over, dozens of times. Over the weeks, he unlearned spontaneity. He no longer laughed by impulse. He stopped asking questions. Every part of his body seemed to be under constant scrutiny. His hands, his voice, even his breathing. Naturalness was replaced by performance, childhood by rehearsal. Egrillo spoke little, but enough for Felix to understand the weight of the role he was being shaped for. You're not an ordinary slave. You're a reflection, a mirror of the desires of whoever owns you. That sentence echoed like a dark refrain. The goal wasn't to teach virtues, but compliance. The boy wasn't meant to have preferences, opinions, or will. He was to be molded to fit someone else's taste. In addition to posture lessons came baths with aromatic essences, oils applied by specialized servants, and daily dressing in garments specific to each occasion. Every fabric had a purpose: to highlight youth, suggest innocence, disguise any trace of resistance. Even the hairstyles were crafted with obsession. Felix chose nothing, not even the color of the ribbon that tied his hair. In moments of exhaustion, the boy tried to find comfort in memories of life beyond the walls, the scent of firewood, the touch of his mother's hands. But each memory felt more distant with every passing day. The only constant now was the mirror before which Egrillo made him rehearse expressions day after day until he forgot his own face. The violence there didn't come from whips, it came from refinement, from the progressive erasure of his identity, from the forced construction of a persona whose only purpose was to be desired, not as a person, but as a symbol. Rome prided itself on its order, its civilization, its gods. But there, inside a silent palace, the cruelest art of all was taught. The art of turning a human being into a walking spectacle, docile, beautiful, empty. Felix was learning to be everything they expected of him, except himself. That night, everything was prepared as if for a divine celebration. The scents of wine, meat, and incense blended in the thick air of the palace's main hall. Oriental rugs covered the marble floors, torches framed the columns, and a ceremonial silence signaled that something special would be unveiled. It was Felix's first banquet, the moment when his existence would cease to be secret and become part of the senator's official inventory of pleasures. Felix was bathed 3 times that day. He was dressed in a sheer white linen tunic with no ornaments, no jewelry, just skin and lightness. His hair was perfumed with myrrh oil, his lips moistened with sweet wine. He was no longer a child, he was a luxury item about to be displayed among goblets, laughter, and Latin words laced with double meanings. As the doors opened, eyes consumed him. 30 men, all senators, merchants, magistrates. None greeted him, none called him by name, but all stared as if he were a rare animal. His role was to circulate silently, softly play a flute, and smile when required, but not too much. Excessive expression would be seen as vulgar. Felix couldn't eat, couldn't sit, couldn't show that he was cold, thirsty, or afraid. A slight tremor in his hand was enough for Egrillo, the eunuch who trained him, to approach with a corrective glance. The boy adjusted himself, took a deep breath, continued his silent parade, while obscene words were whispered among the guests. When the party ended and the last glasses were emptied, he wasn't taken to his quarters, because he had none. He was led directly to the senator's chamber. There, where the tapestries muffled the sound, the violence ceased to be symbolic. Without witnesses, luxury became a cloister. The smile he had learned to hold crumbled. The upright posture collapsed. The body he had been taught to display became a prison with no escape route. The next morning, no one spoke of what had happened. The senator greeted the servants as usual. The palace continued in order, and Felix was prepared again, as if the previous night hadn't been an assault, but a ceremony. There, he understood that his role wasn't merely aesthetic. It was strategic. He wasn't a boy protected by comfort. He was a human display used to entertain, seduce, silence. And every banquet would be a repetition of the same ritual. Offer his presence as a gift, his body as an offering, his pain as a secret. In the Rome of virtues and speeches, there was a place reserved for boys like him, a place where beauty was a sentence, and silence the only defense allowed. The dinners continued, the ceremonies too. Felix already knew the exact moment to smile, the exact tone to play his flute, the perfect tilt of his head to appear graceful without seeming provocative. He no longer made mistakes, but he no longer dreamed either. The boy who had arrived there at 12 no longer existed. What remained was an appearance controlled by invisible commands. 3 years after his first night as a concubine, Felix's body began to show signs of exhaustion. Small fainting spells came without warning. At first, they said it was weakness. Then, they called it sensitivity. But he knew it was something deeper. It was as if his mind, tired of faking normality, began shutting itself off to escape. The nights grew unbearably long. Even when his body rested, his eyes wouldn't close. He tossed and turned on the perfumed bed that felt more like an altar of emotional torture. Insomnia became routine, and with it came tremors, blackouts, memory lapses. Wounds started to appear on his skin, without any clear cause. The house physician, a Greek slave trained in medicine, said it was excessive sensitivity. He called Felix delicate, as if he were an ancient vase that cracked at the slightest touch. But what no one dared to say aloud was the obvious. What was breaking wasn't his body, it was his spirit. During the day, Felix still performed his rituals, attended the banquets, was displayed to foreign guests, remained silent when the senator took him to his chambers. But each night, his presence grew emptier. He no longer responded to orders with the same swiftness, no longer faked with the same precision. At times, it was as if he wasn't there anymore, as if his body moved by reflex, while his mind hid in some deep corner no one could reach. He began to forget simple words, confused names, lost his train of thought mid-sentence, and when corrected, he just lowered his eyes. There was no anger left, only exhaustion. Gradually, even the servants began to see him as something broken, no longer the object of admiration and envy in the halls, but a trembling shadow walking silently across the palace marble. He didn't beg for help. There was no one to beg to. Felix suffered from no physical illness. His diagnosis was the same as many who had gone through the same nameless ordeal: chronic trauma, psychic collapse, a soul crushed under layers of obedience, fear, and solitude. But Rome had no name for it, and silence once again was the only permitted remedy. On the mansion's facade, nothing changed. The parties continued. The senator smiled, wine was served. But inside the untouchable's room, a young man was falling apart in silence, and no one seemed to notice. At 17, Felix no longer drew the same gazes. His beauty, still intact, was now considered too mature for the tastes of an empire obsessed with eternal youth. His skin, once praised as living porcelain, had become merely a reminder of time, something Rome had learned to despise once it ceased to serve pleasure. It was on an ordinary morning that the arrival of another boy was announced. Younger, fresher, brought from a distant region, with rare-colored eyes and hair like strands of gold. The new favorite's entrance was silent, but devastating. Felix was given no explanation. There was no ceremony, just a dry order to gather his belongings and leave his quarters. He was taken to the stables where the servants assigned to manual labor and lesser tasks were housed. But unlike the others, he wasn't treated as one of them. He was the former favorite, a strange figure marked by the past, feared by some and ridiculed by others. The common slaves avoided him, not out of contempt, but discomfort, as if he carried a visible curse. Palace attendants lowered their eyes when they saw him pass. Some whispered, others simply turned away. The one once trained to serve wine gracefully and smile with submission now cleaned straw under the indifferent gaze of those who once silently applauded him. The humiliation didn't come from whippings, but from the absence of meaning. The senator who had possessed him for 5 years never looked his way again. It was then Felix understood there was no love, no bond, not even memory, only use. His body had been a tool, and like all tools, once it showed signs of wear, it was replaced, without farewell, without gratitude, without a name. What hurt the most wasn't the rejection, it was the emptiness. It was realizing that even after years of submission, his worth had always depended on an external standard: age, freshness, silence. He had never truly been someone, just a reflection of someone else's desire. In the stable, he cleaned animal waste, scraped wood, and tended to harnesses with hands once reserved for luxury. Every movement was a cruel reminder of what he had lost. But slowly, he began to see what had once been invisible. There, among horses and mud, no one touched him. No one called for him during the night. No one violated his body. For the first time, despite the pain, there was a thread of autonomy. Freedom was still out of reach. But the end of being used meant, paradoxically, the beginning of a new kind of survival, less gilded, more real. And on that cold, dirty ground, Felix began to discover what it meant to exist outside of someone else's desire. The cold in the stables was constant, but there was something even colder than the marble walls, the absence of meaning. Until, on one of the longest nights of winter, Felix met Livius. He was another young man, slightly older, with eyes that no longer shone, and gestures as small as someone who had already learned to ration hope. He too had been a favorite. He too had been discarded. And now, like Felix, he survived among remnants of food, of memory, of himself. At first they exchanged only silences, then gestures, a piece of bread shared, a borrowed cloth, small favors that anywhere else would go unnoticed. But there, among men conditioned not to feel, any act of kindness carried the weight of an earthquake. Over time, their coexistence gave way to something they never dared to name. It wasn't desire, it was refuge. When one trembled at night, the other covered him with his own cloak. When one couldn't bear the weight of humiliation, the other whispered words to chase away the ghosts. It was pure affection. But in Rome, purity between slaves was dangerous, especially if it wasn't bought, ordered, or performed. They were reported by a guard. The accusation mentioned no touch, no kiss. It was enough to say, they share glances. That was enough to decree punishment. The empire that allowed public orgies among senators did not tolerate tenderness between captives. Love was acceptable, as long as it was one-sided, as long as it was cruel. The next morning, Felix was tied up in the inner courtyard. 2 guards held his arms, while a third whipped his back with thick leather straps. There was no trial, no defense. The crime was loving without permission. Livius, meanwhile, vanished before dawn. Some said he was sold to a mine in Hispania, others that his body had been thrown into the Tiber. Felix never found out. But that same night, after bleeding and vomiting on the cold ground, he realized something inside him had changed. The pain wasn't new, But losing Livius taught him that even in the deepest servitude, the soul could still form bonds, and that when those bonds were violently severed, they left wounds deeper than any whip. From then on, he didn't cry anymore. Not because he was strong, but because a part of him had gone silent forever. The most sensitive part of his being had been crushed by boots that demanded obedience but couldn't bear humanity. Rome wanted docile slaves, not hearts that dared to beat off script. In the darkness of the stables alone, Felix began to speak less and write more. He started scribbling on scraps of cloth among horse manure and barley dust. He wrote about Livius, about the silence that united them, and about what remained of what they called love, because even the cruelest empire could not confiscate memories, nor erase with whips what two hearts had built in the dark. The days following the punishment were full of fever, nausea, and a silence thicker than the air. Felix staggered between the stables and the slave infirmary, wrapped in dirty gauze, and met with indifferent stares. But something in him was different now. A faint thread of rebellion was growing inside, not a cry for freedom, but a desire to be acknowledged, even if only as a victim. It was that spark that led him to the door of a local praetor, one of those mid-level judges responsible for minor plebeian affairs. It wasn't easy. He had to convince an older slave to show him the way. He walked through alleys and Rome's damp streets, with his wounds throbbing under his clothes. When he arrived, he sat at the entrance of the courthouse and waited silently for 3 hours. No one noticed, until finally a guard shoved him inside, amused by his persistence. "Looks like we've got a little philosopher here," he mocked. Before the magistrate, Felix struggled to speak. His words came out hesitantly, with a rough accent and broken grammar. But there was truth in every syllable. He spoke of the years in captivity, the abuse, the loss of Livius, and he ended with a simple request to be recognized as a person. The silence that followed lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it felt eternal. Then the praetor laughed. Not an open laugh, but a muffled sneer. "Objects don't press charges against citizens," he said. And with a gesture, he ordered Felix returned to the senator like a lost horse sent back to its stable. Felix's report was never recorded. No clay tablet, no parchment carried his plea. On the contrary, in the gossip circles of the forum staff, his attempt became a joke, a slave in love, an old toy trying to speak of laws. When he returned to the palace, he carried more scars than before. The senator didn't like his defiance. He ordered him branded with a hot iron, a spiral symbol burned into the inside of his arm, a mark of rebellion among his kind. There, Felix understood a bitter truth. In that empire where law was praised as the highest virtue, he wasn't even considered a subject. He was property, and property had no justice, only owners. That failed attempt to appeal to the law didn't erase his will to exist, but it did something worse. It carved into him the certainty that for the powerful, the suffering of disposable bodies was just an invisible detail. There was no courtroom for those who loved in the shadows. No judge for those born outside of privilege. After that, Felix stopped looking at men with hope. He began writing more often, but not like someone trying to change the world. He wrote like someone refusing to vanish, like someone who knew his story might not save anyone, but could one day be read and finally understood. The days following the failed trial were the quietest of Felix's life. There were no screams, no whippings, no mocking laughter, just a kind of death that happens silently when the soul leaves before the body does. He walked through the palace like a shadow, drawing neither attention nor pity. Other slaves avoided his gaze. The servants pretended not to see him. He was no longer desired, useful, or dangerous. He was just a forgotten weight inside marble walls. That night, when everyone was asleep, Felix could no longer bear his own body. The fabric itched. His skin burned without cause. He felt the weight of breathing like an invisible chain. So, with light steps and a cloth over his shoulders, he walked to the rear terrace, a place used to dry sheets, where no one usually went after dusk. There, far from the lit corridors, he saw Rome as few could, small, contained by scattered flames, surrounded by the growls of distant dogs and the echo of night voices. He sat on the edge. His legs dangled, and for a long time, nothing moved. His hands were cold, his eyes dry. There was no more fear. Fear had already passed. There was only a sense of weariness so heavy that the world felt made of stone. And that's when he remembered his mother. Not her face with clarity, for time had already stolen her features, but her voice, hoarse, steady, with the scent of baked bread and field sweat. She used to say, when he fell and bled, "You are more than what they say. What's on the outside doesn't define you." In childhood, it sounded like comfort. In that moment, it sounded like salvation. Felix didn't jump. He started breathing slowly again. Not because the pain had ended, but because something inside him, maybe the memory, maybe wounded pride, maybe what was left of his soul, decided not to grant final victory to those who had erased him. That would not be his last night, not like that. He climbed down from the terrace with faltering steps, returned to the quarters, lay down on the stone floor, and cried for the first time in years. But it wasn't a cry of despair. It was an old, deep lament that washed away what had been silenced for far too long. From that night on, Felix never tried to die again. But he never tried to please either. He became something else, a silent survivor, invisible but aware of every inch of his pain. And that, small as it seemed, was an act of resistance. In a society that treated him like a disposable toy, staying alive and remembering was the most revolutionary gesture he could offer. The years passed without anyone counting them. Felix no longer stirred reactions in the corridors, nor sparked desire in others' eyes. His skin, once praised by the senator, now bore marks. The soft features had hardened. His gaze was no longer one of obedience, but of a survivor. When he turned 30, he was no longer useful nor remembered. The order came like a note of disposal. He was to be sold to an entertainment house on the outskirts of Rome. There, the former favorite would serve as a tutor to new boys brought in by force. When he arrived, he was received without ceremony. The house owners knew who he had been. They knew what his presence represented. It was prestigious to have a palace model among the instructors. But for Felix, it was a new form of punishment. He would now be the bridge between innocence and deformation. His task was to teach the boys how to smile, how to dress, how to speak without speaking. He taught without emotion, as if each lesson was a blade returning to his own flesh. At night, however, something was different. In the dim light of the room he was given, small, but with a lock on the inside, Felix wrote. He used leftover parchment, bits of charcoal, dregs of ink mixed with wine. What he recorded wasn't just a diary. It was a testimony, a desperate effort not to vanish without a trace. He wrote names, dates, routines. He described the process of shaping a concubine, the power dynamics, the forced silences, the banquets, the punishments. More than facts, he wrote sensations. The first time he felt disgust, the first time he wanted to disappear, the day he loved and lost Livius. He kept the writings under a loose stone in the floor, wrapped in old cloth and tied with strands of his own hair. That was his legacy, not out of vanity. Felix knew he would never be remembered as a free man, but for justice, because if one day someone read those words, they might understand that behind the splendor of imperial Rome there was blood not spilled in battle, but in cold beds. He knew he wouldn't break the cycle. He saw boys arrive, be groomed, sold, and vanish. He knew he too would be replaced there, and that his bones might end up in anonymous pits like so many others. Still, he wrote, because there was a strange force, not greater than the pain, but more persistent, that pushed him to the task of recording. Maybe it was what remained of his mother within him. Maybe it was the same force that stopped him from jumping that night on the terrace. A small spark that said, if no one hears you now, maybe they'll read you later. And that, for someone who had spent his entire life being erased, was already a reason to keep going. The centuries moved on, mercilessly, burying empires and silencing witnesses. But memory, no matter how hard they try to erase it, finds ways to survive. On a sweltering morning in 1892, excavations on the outskirts of Rome's Trastevere district unearthed something unexpected, a set of parchment fragments wrapped in old fabric and preserved in a crack between dry stones. At first, archaeologists thought they were household notes or supply lists from some ancient village. But as they translated the contents, a disquieting truth emerged. It was the raw, intimate account of a young enslaved man. The phrases were simple, the grammar riddled with mistakes, but the pain was undeniable. The signature, scribbled on one of the final pages, made it clear, "My name is Felix, and this was my life." The manuscript wasn't a typical diary, it was an accusation. With almost clinical precision, Felix narrated recurring practices among senatorial families, the selection of young slaves, the forced training, the ceremonial banquets where they were displayed as human trophies. He named influential patricians, described hallways, punishment methods, parties, and even the disappearances of other boys like Livius. The discovery caused unrest behind academic doors. The content was too disturbing, and the names mentioned included lineages that still held prestige in Italian society. Instead of being announced to the world, the manuscript was quietly archived by a religious order with access to the material, under the pretext of avoiding historical misinterpretations. It remained locked for decades in an underground vault of an ecclesiastical library, classified as a sensitive document. It wasn't until the 1970s, during a revision of ecclesiastical archives, that a young researcher named Lucia Benedetti came across the fragments again. When she read them, she understood the weight of what she held, yet even then she faced resistance in trying to publish them. The official version of Roman records didn't want to admit that behind the marble, the military glories, and the speeches on virtue, there existed a structured system of boy exploitation. Still, part of the content was eventually released in an independent publication by the University of Turin, with a limited run and little international visibility. Even without widespread recognition, Felix's writing found new eyes, and most of all, a chance not to be forgotten. Those pieces of parchment, written in secret by a man history tried to erase, became more than just ancient pages. They became a voice that crossed centuries. A voice that hadn't had the strength to scream at the time, but that now finally could be heard, even if too late to save him. Felix never knew his testimony would be found. But by hiding his words beneath the stone of that room, perhaps he dreamed of it. Perhaps he believed, even if only for a moment, that someone would one day call him by name. For centuries, Rome was celebrated as the cradle of law, civilization, and military greatness. But no carved marble, no triumphal arch was able to contain what lay beneath. The bones of injustice, the flesh of servitude, the blood of those who never had names on statues. It is thanks to manuscripts like Felix's that we can now see what the books chose to silence. They reveal that behind the imposing columns and speeches about virtue, there was a perfectly organized system of pain, where youth was a commodity, where silence was rewarded, and where affection, when it arose by its own will, was punished with brutality. These pages are not just historical documents, they are the empire's overdue confessions. They tear apart the golden image of the Rome taught in schools, showing that empires are not upheld by military glory alone, but also by the normalization of cruelty. That between gold and power, there were boys trained to smile while being devoured by fear. Felix was not the only one. He was merely the one who dared to write, to leave behind, even in secret, a testimony that burned inside. His voice crossed through disasters, churches, locked libraries, and entire centuries of denial. And today, it echoes louder than it ever could have in life. This is not just about recovering the story of one man, but about acknowledging the many others who lived, suffered, and died without even being mentioned. Because every civilization that silences its oppressed is only delaying the moment when the truth will come to light, through the ruins, through the cracks, through the voices that refuse to disappear. Felix's story is not an exception. It is a window. And through that crack, we can glimpse an empire that was not only made of victories and marble, but of silent pacts, buried sufferings, and lives consumed in the name of power. If this account reached you in any way, subscribe now to keep accessing truths the centuries tried to erase. Every video on this channel is an invitation to see beyond the official version. Share this story with someone who still believes the past was only glory and conquest. Because sometimes what frightens most is not what was said, but what they did everything to hide. And in the next revelations you'll see, historical silence can be just as brutal as the edge of a sword.